For months, the sports world has been stuck on one number like it's a crime scene clue nobody can stop staring at. $76,000. Not because people suddenly became obsessed with payroll spreadsheets. Not because fans woke up and decided salary caps were entertaining. But because that number became a symbol of something deeper. And honestly, something way more uncomfortable for the WNBA. It wasn't just low. It looked unreal. It looked like the kind of salary you'd expect from a normal job in a normal city. Not the paycheck tied to a player who can tilt an entire sports economy just by showing up. Caitlin Clark walked into the league as the most visible women's basketball athlete on the planet, with cameras following her, arenas resizing their expectations, and ticket sites behaving like it was playoff season every time her name appeared on the schedule. And then people realized her league salary was sitting in the same range as jobs that don't come with national TV contracts and security details. That's why the $76,000 number exploded. It wasn't only unfair in a moral sense. It felt like the league had accidentally exposed the wiring behind the wall, the part they usually keep covered. Because when you watch a player generate sold-out crowds, jumpstart media coverage, and turn regular season games into headline events, the brain naturally assumes the system must be built to reward that. That's the unspoken promise of pro sports. If you move the needle, you get paid like you move the needle. But the WNBA structure wasn't designed for a needle mover on this scale. And that's the part casual fans didn't understand at first. Most people weren't reacting to a contract. They were reacting to the realization that the league's entire financial architecture was built for a different era. An era where growth was slow, predictable, and controlled. An era where no single player could walk in and instantly become the gravitational center of the entire business. The moment Clark arrived, that era ended. The problem is, the league didn't admit it. Not publicly. Not directly. They kept operating like they still had time. Like they could use the same playbook. Like they could repeat the same explanations. That's the CBA. That's the rookie scale. That's how it works. And technically, all of those things were true. But here's what made it combustible. The market didn't care what was technically true. The market reacts to value. Not tradition. Not precedent. Not the way it's always been done. And once people felt the gap between Clark's value and Clark's check, the league's messaging started to sound like a script written for a world that no longer exists. Because this wasn't about one player wanting a bigger paycheck. This was about millions of people realizing the system wasn't keeping up with reality. You could see it in the way games were suddenly moved to bigger arenas because the usual ones couldn't handle the demand. You could see it in the way road games turned into home games because visiting crowds were wearing her jersey. You could see it in how ticket prices surged like the league had been hiding a premium product in plain sight. And you could see it in the way debates turned hostile, not because fans were trying to attack the league, but because they were trying to make sense of something that looked impossible. How can someone be this valuable and still be paid like this? That question doesn't just create outrage. It creates pressure. Because now every conversation becomes a countdown. How long can this last? How long can you keep a player in that box? How long can you keep telling the world, this is normal, when the world can clearly see it's not? And here's where it gets even more interesting. The league didn't have to say anything for people to understand the stakes. When a sports league finds itself being mocked by people who don't even watch the sport, that's not just bad PR. That's a credibility problem. It's the outside world looking in and saying, if this is how you treat your biggest star, what does that say about the business behind the product? That's when sponsors start paying attention. That's when networks start paying attention. That's when investors start asking uncomfortable questions. Because if the league can't translate star power into a sensible financial model, then the growth might not be stable. It might be a temporary spike. And stability is what billion-dollar partners care about more than anything. So the WNBA ended up stuck in a trap of its own design. The old structure, rookie scale, caps, controlled wages, used to protect the league from chaos. It kept things predictable. It kept things manageable. It kept the business from outrunning the infrastructure. But now the infrastructure is what's holding the league back. Because the Caitlin Clark era isn't slow. It's fast. It's immediate. It's already monetized. It's already mainstream. And when growth hits like that, the league's normal timeline becomes a liability. That's why this story is bigger than, she deserves more money. The money is only the visible part. The real story is leverage. The league used to have all of it. It was the only stage. The only brand. The only system that mattered. If you wanted to be a pro, you accepted the rules, accepted the structure, accepted the pay scale, and waited your turn. That's how it's always worked in leagues that are still building their financial foundation. But once a player becomes big enough that the league needs her more than she needs the league, the entire balance flips. And that flip is exactly what the WNBA is trying to manage right now. Quietly, strategically, and with more urgency than they want to admit. Because the $76,000 number didn't just make people mad. It made people realize the league was exposed. It revealed a mismatch between the product the WNBA is now selling and the system it still operates under. And once that mismatch becomes public, it doesn't stay theoretical. It becomes a negotiation. It becomes a power struggle. It becomes a test of whether the league can adapt fast enough to keep its biggest asset inside the system. That's the moment the league stopped being able to pretend this was just a rookie contract issue. And that's why the next part of this story matters. Because the money everyone's hearing about now, the rumored new blueprint, the new ceiling, the radical shift being discussed behind the scenes, didn't appear out of nowhere. It showed up because the league found itself staring at a reality it couldn't control anymore. For a long time, the WNBA could explain everything with paperwork. Rookie scale. Salary caps. Collective bargaining agreements. These were the words that shut down most debates before they even started. And for years they worked. The league wasn't lying when it said it couldn't just hand out massive contracts on demand. The structure was negotiated. The numbers were locked in. Everyone played by the same rules. The problem is that rules only work when the market agrees with them. And the market stopped agreeing the moment Caitlin Clark entered the league. Because what happened next wasn't subtle. Attendance didn't just rise. It spiked. Road games didn't just sell better. They sold out. Cities that had never treated WNBA games like must-see events suddenly had resale prices climbing like playoff tickets. Even casual fans, people who couldn't name 5 players in the league a year earlier, knew exactly when Clark was playing and where. That kind of response doesn't come from hype alone. It comes from demand. And demand has a way of exposing weak systems. The WNBA's salary structure was designed for gradual growth. Incremental increases. Careful budgeting. A model where no single player could distort the economics of the entire league. That worked when attention was spread evenly and stars were interchangeable from a business standpoint. But Clark wasn't interchangeable. She was additive in a way the system wasn't built to process. Every time she stepped on the floor, the league made more money. Not theoretically. Not eventually. Immediately. Ticket revenue jumped. Merchandise followed. Broadcast numbers responded. Social media engagement didn't just rise. It shifted toward her like gravity. And once that happens, pretending she's just another rookie on a fixed scale stops making sense to anyone watching. That's where the disconnect began. From the league's perspective, nothing illegal or unusual was happening. They were honoring a negotiated agreement. From the outside, though, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like a business refusing to acknowledge its most valuable asset. And in sports, that's dangerous territory. Because fans understand value instinctively. They might not know the details of a CBA, but they know when something feels off. When a player fills arenas and headlines while earning a salary that doesn't even hint at her impact, the story stops being about fairness and starts being about competence. People begin to ask whether the league actually understands what it has. And that question carries weight. Sponsors don't just invest in leagues, they invest in momentum. Networks don't spend billions for nostalgia. They pay for predictable audiences. When one player becomes the clear driver of both, the league's job is to align its structure with reality as fast as possible. Delay doesn't preserve stability. It erodes confidence. That's why the $76,000 figure kept resurfacing. It wasn't because people wanted to shame the league. It was because the number didn't match the product being sold. It felt like a glitch in the system. The kind that makes everyone wonder what else is misaligned behind the scenes. And the league could feel it. You don't need public statements to know when pressure is building. You see it in reactive decisions. In rushed explanations. In the way leadership suddenly starts emphasizing long-term plans and future adjustments. That language usually appears when the present no longer holds. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The WNBA didn't underpay Clark because they didn't value her. They underpaid her because the system hadn't caught up yet. But explaining that difference to the public is nearly impossible once the gap becomes this visible. The more Clark generated, the louder the silence became. And silence in this situation reads like hesitation. That's when the conversation shifted from what she's making now to what the league is willing to do next. Because once fans, media partners, and industry insiders realize a system is outdated, they don't wait patiently for it to fix itself. They start speculating. They start projecting. They start looking for exits. Which is exactly what began happening. The league could no longer treat this as a theoretical future problem. The Caitlin Clark effect wasn't coming. It was already here. And every game played under the old structure made the mismatch harder to justify. That's the moment the rulebook stopped being the shield it used to be. And that's when the WNBA was forced to confront a much bigger question than salary numbers. How do you control a league when the market has already chosen its centerpiece? And that realization led directly to the next domino. The one involving money. The league had never talked about this openly before. What most people missed while arguing about rookie salaries was the real shift happening behind closed doors. The WNBA wasn't just growing. It was being repriced. When news surfaced that the league had secured a massive new media rights deal, valued at $2.2 billion over 11 years, it instantly reframed everything. This wasn't incremental progress. This wasn't symbolic support. This was a valuation jump that doesn't happen unless the buyer sees something durable, scalable, and worth betting on for the long haul. Media companies don't spend billions on hope. They spend it on data. Networks like ESPN, Amazon, and NBC didn't suddenly wake up and decide to overpay for women's basketball out of goodwill. They paid because the numbers told them something had fundamentally changed. Viewership spikes weren't random. Engagement wasn't evenly distributed. Ratings climbed hardest when one player was on screen. That player was Caitlin Clark. This is where the league's public messaging and private reality started to drift apart. Publicly, the WNBA talked about overall growth, rising interest, and a new era for the sport. Privately, executives understood the truth. The valuation surge had a face. And that face was responsible for pulling in millions of new viewers who hadn't previously been part of the ecosystem. That matters because media deals are leverage. Once the league locked in that $2.2 billion figure, it created a new problem for itself. You can't justify premium pricing to networks while simultaneously treating your main draw like a replaceable piece. The contradiction becomes obvious the moment negotiations begin. Networks don't want uncertainty. They don't want lockouts. And they definitely don't want the possibility that the star driving engagement might walk into the future with options. This is where Commissioner Kathy Engelbert found herself cornered by math. If Clark's presence materially affects ratings, then her absence materially affects the value of the deal. And once that equation is acknowledged internally, everything changes. The league stops negotiating from tradition and starts negotiating from risk management. Not what's fair, but what happens if she's gone? That's why the conversation inside league offices shifted so fast. The old language, rookie scale, patience, long-term vision, started sounding dangerous. Because long-term vision only works if the short-term product remains intact. And the product right now runs through one player. What makes this even more delicate is timing. The media deal didn't arrive after years of Clark being in the league. It arrived almost immediately. That means the networks priced in her future, not just her present. They bought into the expectation that the Caitlin Clark era would be stable, visible, and uninterrupted. Anything that threatens that expectation becomes a problem. This is why the salary conversation couldn't stay small. Once billions enter the picture, six-figure rookie contracts start to look less like structure and more like negligence. From a business standpoint, it becomes difficult to explain why the league's most valuable asset is operating under terms that were negotiated before her value even existed. And that's the quiet irony here. The WNBA didn't get into trouble by growing too slowly. It got into trouble by growing too fast. The media deal locked in a future the league wasn't structurally ready for. It exposed how much of the current system was built on assumptions that no longer apply. Assumptions like no single player drives the market, or fans follow teams, not individuals, or growth will be gradual enough to manage. Those assumptions died the moment the ratings proved otherwise. This is when the league's tone changed. Less certainty. More urgency. More talk about new models, restructuring, and modernization. Because once the money is committed, the pressure doesn't come from fans anymore. It comes from partners who expect delivery. And when billions are on the line, protecting the centerpiece stops being optional. That's why the next development, the leaked salary blueprint everyone's talking about, didn't come from generosity. It came from necessity. At first, the numbers sounded unreal. Reports began circulating that the WNBA was quietly exploring a new salary structure for 2026. One that would allow the league's top players to earn base salaries approaching $1 million. Not someday. Not in a distant, hypothetical future. Soon. And for anyone who remembered the $76,000 rookie contract that sparked the entire debate, the contrast was jarring. But here's the detail most people glossed over. This proposal wasn't rolled out with a press conference. It wasn't celebrated as a milestone. It leaked. And leaks don't happen when organizations feel confident. They happen when someone wants to change the conversation before it turns against them. Inside league circles, this wasn't framed as a raise. It was framed as a structural fix. The WNBA finally acknowledging that the old financial model could not survive a superstar economy. That a league built to spread value evenly now had to account for gravitational players. Athletes whose presence alone reshapes revenue. Under the rumored framework, the base salary was only the beginning. Revenue sharing, marketing incentives, and in-season tournament bonuses would stack on top of that number. In realistic terms, a player like Caitlin Clark could push her league-only income past $1.5 million per year. That's more than a fourfold increase over the existing Supermax. But context matters. Because this wasn't about rewarding loyalty or performance. It was about preventing loss. The proposal reads less like ambition and more like triage. A rushed attempt to modernize before the cracks became visible on national television. The league understood that if they didn't present a credible path towards superstar-level compensation, the conversation wouldn't stay theoretical. It would turn into negotiation. And negotiation requires leverage on both sides. The WNBA didn't have as much leverage as it used to. For decades, the league's power came from exclusivity. If you wanted to play elite women's basketball in the US, this was the stage. The salary cap, the draft, the structure. All of it was accepted because there was no alternative with comparable visibility. That reality is gone. Which is why the $1 million figure wasn't designed to inspire. It was designed to stabilize. To show agents, sponsors, and media partners that the league finally understood the math. That it could evolve. That it wouldn't lose its biggest star because it waited too long to adapt. And here's the part that makes this offer less impressive than it sounds. Even at $1.5 million, the league would still be a secondary income stream for Clark. Her endorsement portfolio already dwarfs that number. Deals with Nike, Gatorade, Wilson, and other global brands pay her multiples of her WNBA salary. That financial independence changes the negotiation entirely. Salary becomes optional. Environment, control, and long-term equity become the real currency. Which raises an uncomfortable question for the league. If she doesn't need the money, what exactly is the $1 million supposed to secure? Because from Clark's perspective, this proposal doesn't represent generosity. It represents delayed recognition. It's the league finally catching up to value that already exists. And once a player realizes that, gratitude disappears. The conversation shifts from appreciation to alignment. There's also the timing. Why 2026? Why leak it now? Because the current collective bargaining agreement is approaching its breaking point. The players' union has already signaled its intent to opt out. That means the entire financial framework is about to be renegotiated. And once that door opens, every number becomes provisional. Every promise becomes a bargaining chip. The league wanted to set the ceiling before someone else did. By floating the $1 million figure early, the WNBA wasn't making an offer. It was anchoring expectations. Trying to define what reasonable looks like before agents start asking for more aggressive terms. Before outside leagues start making noise. Before the public narrative turns into, they're still underpaying her. But anchoring only works when you control the conversation. And at this point, the league doesn't. Because the existence of that proposal immediately triggered the next wave of speculation. If the WNBA is willing to go this far now, what are they afraid of losing? And that question leads directly to the threat that forced the league's hand in the first place. The reason the $1 million proposal exists at all, has very little to do with generosity. It exists because the WNBA is no longer the only serious option in the room. For most of its history, the league operated with a quiet but powerful advantage: monopoly. If you were an elite women's basketball player in the United States, this was the destination. You could complain about travel, salaries, and infrastructure, but at the end of the day, there was nowhere else with comparable visibility, sponsorship access, and legitimacy. That monopoly allowed the league to move slowly, negotiate cautiously, and enforce a structure that favored institutional stability over individual leverage. That advantage just cracked. Enter Unrivaled. On the surface, it looks like a side project. A 3-on-3 league. A shorter season. A different format. Easy to dismiss if you're thinking like an old sports executive. But the real disruption isn't the rules or the schedule. It's the business model. Unrivaled isn't selling salaries. It's selling ownership. Instead of positioning players as labor, it positions them as partners. Equity. Revenue participation. A stake in the league's long-term growth. That single shift changes everything, especially for a player like Caitlin Clark, who already operates more like a brand than an employee. This is what scared the WNBA. Because once players understand the difference between being paid and being invested in, it becomes very hard to sell the old model. A 6-figure or even 7-figure salary looks less impressive when it comes without control, upside, or decision-making power. And for someone whose endorsement income already dwarfs league pay, salary alone stops being persuasive. That's why reports started circulating about Unrivaled preparing a massive offer. Not just money but structure. A deal that treats Clark less like a roster spot and more like a founding asset. Something closer to a Messi-style play. Change the league by securing the player who defines attention. From the WNBA's perspective, this was a nightmare scenario. Not because Unrivaled could immediately replace the WNBA. It can't. Not yet. But because it exposed a truth the league didn't want players to fully internalize. The WNBA no longer controls the ceiling. It only controls one pathway. And pathways are optional. For decades, the league could say, if you want to play here, these are the terms. Now players can say, what if I don't need this stage to maintain relevance? That's a completely different negotiation. It shifts power from institutions to individuals. And Caitlin Clark is uniquely positioned to exploit that shift. She doesn't need the WNBA to build an audience. She already has one. She doesn't need league exposure to attract sponsors. They're already lined up. And she doesn't need to play overseas in the off-season to maximize income, which used to be the leverage point that kept players tethered to the league. Unrivaled offers a domestic alternative that pays well and minimizes risk. This is why the $1 million proposal suddenly appeared. It wasn't meant to compete with Unrivaled's model. It was meant to slow the conversation. To remind players that the WNBA can still write big checks, even if it can't offer equity. To signal that staying put doesn't mean accepting irrelevance or financial sacrifice. But here's the problem. Once the idea of ownership enters the room, you can't unring that bell. Players start asking different questions. Not how much do I make this year? But what do I own 5 years from now? Not what's my salary? But what's my upside? And those questions are brutal for leagues built on centralized control. The existence of Unrivaled also shatters another assumption the WNBA relied on. That players would tolerate unfavorable conditions because there was no alternative. Once that assumption dies, every negotiation becomes more fragile. Every compromise becomes harder to enforce. And this pressure isn't theoretical. It's already shaping behavior. The timing of the leak. The sudden willingness to discuss 7-figure salaries. The urgency in public messaging. None of that happens unless leadership feels its leverage slipping. Because if Caitlin Clark ever decides that equity, flexibility, and long-term control matter more than tradition, the WNBA loses more than a star. It loses the illusion of inevitability. And once that illusion disappears, the next battle isn't financial. It's internal. The moment real money enters a league, silence disappears. Up to now, the WNBA has managed its internal dynamics through shared struggle. Long travel. Modest pay. Limited exposure. Those conditions created a kind of forced unity. Everyone knew the sacrifices were uneven, but they were at least familiar. Nobody was getting rich off the league alone, So resentment stayed mostly theoretical. That balance is about to break. When the idea of a $1 million base salary becomes real, even if it's only for a handful of players, it fundamentally rewires how teammates see each other. Because now the gap isn't symbolic. It's measurable. It's contractual. And it sits in the locker room every single day. Imagine being a veteran who's spent a decade in the league. Playing through injuries. Flying commercial. Grinding overseas in the off-season just to make your real income. You've built the league's foundation. You've defended its relevance when nobody was watching. And now you're making $200,000, maybe a little more, while a third-year player signs a deal worth 5 times that. Even if that player deserves it, emotion doesn't care about spreadsheets. This is where the Caitlin Clark situation becomes volatile. Because her rise didn't happen gradually. It happened all at once. There was no slow adjustment period where the league, the players, and the culture could recalibrate together. One season, she was a college star. The next, she was the economic engine of the league. That kind of acceleration creates whiplash. You could already feel the tension before any million-dollar numbers were leaked. The harder fouls. The awkward interviews. The subtle side eyes when her name dominated coverage. Veterans talking about respect, earning attention, and not skipping steps. None of that language was accidental. It was frustration trying to sound professional. Now add money to that mix. Once contracts become public, and they always do, every missed rotation, every turnover, every loss will be filtered through salary. Teammates won't just be asking whether a play was wrong. They'll be asking whether it was worth the price tag. Opponents won't just be defending her. They'll be making statements. This is how stars become targets. The league already saw a preview of this dynamic during Clark's rookie season. Physical play that crossed into message sending. Incidents that sparked debate about whether she was being welcomed or tested. Those moments weren't just about basketball. They were about hierarchy. About whether someone new could enter the league and immediately sit at the top of the pyramid. A 7-figure contract removes all ambiguity. It doesn't just say she's important. It says she's different. And that's dangerous in a league that has spent decades emphasizing collective progress over individual dominance. The WNBA's identity was built on parity, on teamwork, on the idea that the league itself mattered more than any one player. Introducing extreme pay disparity challenges that identity at its core. Some players will accept it. They'll understand that a rising tide lifts all boats. That Clark's value brings new money, new attention, and eventually better conditions for everyone. But others won't. They'll see a system that suddenly found resources only after a new face arrived. Resources that veterans were told didn't exist for years. That breeds resentment fast. And here's the part the league can't control. Resentment doesn't stay quiet. It leaks into chemistry. Into effort. Into trust. Into the willingness to sacrifice. You can't build a healthy locker room when players feel like the system values one person more than their entire career. The commissioner knows this. Front offices know this. Coaches definitely know this. But they're trapped. Because the alternative, refusing to pay Clark what the market demands, is worse. That risks losing the star who's driving growth. So the league is forced to choose between internal harmony and external survival. That's not a fair choice. But it's the one they're facing. And this tension doesn't just stay within teams. It spills into public discourse. Into podcasts. Into anonymous quotes. Into deleted tweets, and carefully worded comments that say more by what they avoid than what they state directly. Every player becomes a potential soundbite. Every disagreement becomes a headline. The more money Clark makes, the heavier that spotlight becomes. Which leads to a brutal reality the league doesn't want to admit. Paying her more doesn't solve the problem. It amplifies it. It turns an already complicated cultural shift into a stress test for the entire ecosystem. And that's before you even factor in the most dangerous idea in modern sports economics. The idea that salary might not be enough. Because once players start thinking beyond paychecks, the conversation moves into territory the WNBA has never fully navigated. Ownership. Equity. Control. And that's where this story stops being about contracts and starts being about power. Here's the part of the conversation that makes league executives deeply uncomfortable. Money is no longer the main leverage. For most professional athletes, salary is the center of gravity. It determines where you play, how long you stay, and how much power you have at the negotiating table. The higher the number, the louder the voice. That's how sports have always worked. Caitlin Clark breaks that logic. Even before the WNBA started floating seven-figure salaries, Clark had already crossed into a different category of athlete. Her endorsement income alone reshaped her position in every negotiation. Nike, Gatorade, Wilson. National campaigns that don't depend on her box score or her minutes. These deals don't fluctuate with the WNBA cap. They don't disappear if she misses a game. They exist independently of the league's approval. That financial independence changes everything. When a player doesn't rely on league salary for security, the league loses its most effective form of control. The threat of, "this is what we can afford," stops working. The idea of, "wait your turn," loses meaning. Because from Clark's perspective, the question isn't, "how much do I make this season?" It's, "what am I committing myself to long-term?" This is where the equity conversation enters the picture. Sports business analysts have already started speculating that Clark's camp isn't focused on maximizing salary alone. They're looking at valuation, at revenue streams, at ownership structures, at how much of the league's explosive growth can be tied directly to her presence, and whether that entitles her to more than a paycheck. In other words, why should she settle for being paid by the system when she is actively inflating the value of the system? This idea terrifies traditional leagues. Because once a player starts asking for a slice of the pie instead of a bigger slice of salary, the entire power dynamic collapses. Salary can be capped. Ownership can't. Revenue sharing can't be easily reversed. Once granted, it becomes precedent. And Clark has leverage few athletes in history have ever possessed. She doesn't need to threaten a holdout to be taken seriously. She doesn't need to leak dissatisfaction. Her options speak for her. She can play. She can wait. She can limit her participation. She can choose alternative platforms. None of those moves damage her brand. In some scenarios they enhance it. That's the nightmare scenario for the WNBA. Because if the league refuses to meet her where she is, financially and structurally, she doesn't have to compromise. She can simply say no. And saying no doesn't mean disappearing. It means redirecting attention elsewhere. That's a luxury almost no player has ever had at this stage of their career. The rumored $28 million Nike deal makes this impossible to ignore. When an athlete earns more in a handful of commercial appearances than most players earn across entire careers, the league stops being the provider and starts being the platform. And platforms have to compete. This is why the $1 million proposal feels small when you zoom out. It's meaningful in league history, but it doesn't address the core issue. Clark is no longer negotiating from need. She's negotiating from position. Which forces the league into a corner. If they say yes to equity, they risk destabilizing the entire ownership model. If they say no, they risk watching the most valuable asset in women's basketball explore alternatives without fear. There's no clean outcome here. No compromise that satisfies everyone. Because once a player understands her true market power, she doesn't unlearn it. And the league knows it. That's why the upcoming collective bargaining negotiations aren't just about wages, travel, or benefits. They're about redefining the relationship between player and institution. About deciding whether the future of the WNBA is centralized and controlled, or flexible and star-driven. And that decision isn't theoretical. It has a deadline. Because the next season isn't just another year on the calendar. It's the moment the entire system gets rewritten, or ripped apart. All of this converges on one unavoidable moment. The end of the current collective bargaining agreement. The WNBPA has already made it clear they intend to opt out. That single decision quietly set a clock ticking across the entire league. Once the opt-out is triggered, nothing stays protected. Salaries, revenue splits, travel standards, benefits, prioritization rules. Everything goes back on the table at the same time. That's why 2026 feels different. This isn't a normal negotiation cycle where both sides posture, leak selective optimism, and eventually shake hands. This one is loaded with risk. Because the league is renegotiating from a position it's never been in before. High visibility with fragile structure. In past CBAs, the WNBA could argue scarcity. Limited revenue. Tight margins. Survival mode. Players pushed for improvements, But everyone understood the constraints. The league's growth was real, but modest enough to justify caution. That argument no longer works. The media deal erased it. Once billions are committed, "We can't afford it" stops being persuasive. Especially when players have already watched the league suddenly find money for charter flights after years of being told it was impossible. That decision alone changed the tone of trust between players and leadership. For years, commercial travel was framed as an unfortunate necessity. Budget realities. Financial discipline. Then one rookie arrived, security concerns were raised, and suddenly $25 million appeared to fund private charters. From a player's perspective, the message was loud even if it wasn't intentional. The money was always there when the motivation was strong enough. That realization matters going into negotiations. Because trust is currency in labor talks. And right now trust is thin. Commissioner Kathy Engelbert isn't just negotiating a contract. She's negotiating credibility. Every promise will be scrutinized. Every limitation questioned. Every claim of financial constraint weighed against recent decisions that contradict it. And hovering over all of this is the unspoken threat of a lockout. A lockout would be catastrophic at this moment in the league's history. Just as the WNBA has broken into mainstream relevance, just as new fans are forming habits, just as sponsors and networks are invested in continuity, a shutdown would signal instability. It would tell the market that the league couldn't manage its own success. Media partners didn't buy rights to dead air. There are already rumors, quiet but persistent, that networks are applying pressure behind the scenes. Not publicly. Not through statements. But through expectations. They want certainty. They want assurance that the Caitlin Clark era won't be interrupted by labor chaos. Because their financial models assume she's on the floor, not on the sidelines while executives argue. This external pressure limits how hard the league can play. At the same time, players understand their leverage has never been stronger. Ratings. Attendance. Sponsorships. Everything is up. And much of that growth can be traced to star-driven interest. That gives the union confidence to demand structural changes that would have been dismissed years ago. Better travel isn't a luxury anymore. It's a standard. Higher salaries aren't aspirational. They're overdue. And the idea that top players should participate in the upside they create is no longer radical. It's aligned with how modern sports businesses operate. Which leaves the league in a narrow corridor. Move too slowly, and you risk losing the player driving the growth. Move too fast, and you risk internal fracture, ownership backlash, and long-term instability. Either way, the status quo is dead. This is why panic has replaced patience. The leaked salary numbers. The sudden openness to restructuring. The urgency in messaging. These aren't signs of confidence. They're signs of a league racing its own timeline, trying to modernize before the consequences of delay become irreversible. Because once the CBA expires, control doesn't belong to tradition anymore. It belongs to whoever can afford to walk away. And for the first time in its history, the WNBA is negotiating with players, especially one player, who actually can. When you zoom all the way out, this story stops being about Caitlin Clark's salary. The $76,000 figure mattered because it exposed a flaw. The $1 million proposal matters because it confirms that flaw was real. What the WNBA is facing right now is something every growing league eventually encounters, but rarely this fast. The moment when the system built for protection collides with a star powerful enough to demand evolution. For decades, the league survived by controlling pace. Controlled growth. Controlled wages. Controlled narratives. That strategy kept the doors open when the margins were thin and the spotlight was small. But the spotlight is no longer small. Caitlin Clark didn't just bring attention. She brought acceleration. She compressed 10 years of gradual growth into a single season. And acceleration breaks systems that rely on patience. You can't ask the market to slow down. You can only adapt or get dragged. That's why the leaked contract numbers feel less like celebration and more like a warning. The league isn't saying, "Look how far we've come." It's saying, "We know we can't go back." The old era, where superstars waited quietly, where players had no leverage, where the league dictated terms without pushback, is over. And what replaces it is still unclear. Maybe the WNBA finds a balance. A model where stars are paid closer to their value without blowing apart locker rooms. Maybe revenue sharing becomes normalized. Maybe prioritization keeps players domestic. Maybe equity stays off the table. For now. Or maybe this is just the beginning of a much larger power shift, one where players operate more like partners than employees, and leagues have to compete for loyalty instead of assuming it. What's certain is this. Caitlin Clark is no longer just a basketball player inside the system. She is a stress test. Every decision the league makes, on salary, on structure, on culture, on ownership, will be measured against one question. Does this system make sense in a world where one player can move markets? If the answer is no, then no amount of tradition will save it. The WNBA is standing at a crossroads it didn't expect to reach this quickly. One path leads to adaptation, discomfort, and long-term stability. The other leads to resistance, fracture, and the risk of watching the future choose a different direction. The days of symbolic progress are gone. The days of underpaying value are gone. The days of pretending the market doesn't matter are gone. The price of survival has gone up. And for the first time in its history, the WNBA doesn't get to set that price alone. If you're interested in deep breakdowns like this, where sports, money, and power collide, this is exactly what this channel is built for. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, like the video if this analysis added value, and leave a comment with your take. Do you think the WNBA can adapt fast enough? Or is the system already outdated? Your engagement directly helps this channel grow, and it keeps conversations like this going.